Hi everybody, my name is Jenna and today we're going to try some watercolor methods of flowers and trees. So you will first need a piece of watercolor paper. I highly recommend a textured paper for this. It doesn't have to be watercolor, but mixed media can work. And you will need a pencil, watercolors. You can use a small kit like this, or if you have your own set, that's great. And you need water and a brush and some paper towels. Okay, so we're gonna label our artwork first. So at the top, we're gonna put watercolor flora. So we're gonna do 3 types of flowers that you can find in California. We have the lupin, California poppy, and a wild iris. We're also going to do 3 types of trees. So we're going to start with the deciduous tree. These are trees that lose their leaves in the fall. We're going to try a cypress tree, which grow on the coast in California, and we're going to try a fir tree. These grow at higher elevations. Redwoods grow on the coast, but most fir trees grow at higher elevations. So we're going to start with a pencil sketch for our flora and the trees. So let's start with the lupin. You're going to create sort of like a teardrop shape for the base of each flower. 3 or 4 of these teardrops. And these keep going up like a stalk, kind of like a corn stalk. And we're going to draw pretty lightly because we're not going to erase. And then a little stem coming down. I put my label a little high, that's okay. Okay, and then another flower up here. So they get slightly skinnier as you go up the stalk. You might be able to see the side of a few others. And one little one down here. It's just beginning to bloom. Okay, and the leaves for the lupin are like 5 or 6 kind of fan-shaped leaves. All right, now for the poppy, we're gonna create one that's really wide open. So we're gonna draw the top of it first, kind of a jagged line. And then it's kind of a bowl shape for this flower when they're fully open. And then you'll see the back petal behind or above the first petal. There's a little lip under the poppy, and then the stem tapers down from there. Let's do one that isn't open yet. So these look like a long almond shape with the lip and the stem. And then we'll do one more that's slightly open. So just a slightly smaller jagged top, tapering off towards the bottom. And you might see one petal overlapping the other. And the leaves for the poppy are 3 little fan shapes, sort of similar to the lupin, but just 3 usually you only see. And we'll see a little bit of this back petal. So we're not pressing super hard because we're going to use watercolor directly over the pencil. Now for the iris, we're going to add 2 long petals that are symmetrical coming up. And then the way the iris opens is this really big, beautiful petal that comes out towards you usually. And there's a big spot of yellow on an iris that's like, makes it very iconic. So these petals are nice and chunky. And maybe you see part of another petal, but not all of it. And then the stem for the iris is pretty chunky also. And we'll do another iris behind it that isn't quite open yet. So you'll just see the top of the purple on the iris and the bud of the stem. And irises have these, they're a type of lily, so they have these beautiful long grass-like faces. So we'll add a few blades of this grass. Okay, now we're gonna add some trees. So the first tree, the deciduous tree, is like a standard, what you think of as a tree. So we're gonna start with a long trunk. Draw a parallel line to the first one that tapers towards the top. And then we're gonna just draw a couple of the branches that they come off pretty horizontal, sort of at an angle reaching up to the sky. Most of what we do on this tree will be done with paint. So we're just kind of drawing the skeleton of the tree. We'll add the leaves all around it. So we'll have something like this. All right. And then for the fir trees, we're gonna add 3 long lines for our fir trees and maybe a few more behind that. And we're gonna create atmospheric perspective. So the trees are gonna look lighter in the background. And the last tree that we're gonna try today is called a cypress. So we're gonna draw a long trunk, just like we did for the deciduous tree, a parallel line. And then with cypress trees on the coast, their leaves grow very horizontal. And they're very iconic in that way. So when you draw the leaves coming off of a cypress, I like to draw really long, flat lines and give it some holes. Like you'll see through some of the leaves and the branches. So when you have holes, it really makes it look more like a cypress. And we'll add some branches coming up into the cypress. And maybe a smaller one in the background. So they have really irregular branches, but very beautiful and iconic in a California landscape. All right, so we're gonna start painting, and you want to make some really light purple. So I highly recommend you have a magenta color, because red and blue in most watercolor sets, they don't make a beautiful purple, sadly. So if you mix magenta and blue, it comes out really nicely, the purple. So we're gonna start with a wash for our lupins, and we're just gonna put a little bit of water on each petal with no pigment or very little pigment in there in your brush. So adding a little water to each petal. And now we're gonna add our watered down purple. You can use magenta with phthalo blue and really water it down. So it's a light value when we start. and add a little bit of value on your lupin. And do not touch the top because the tops are yellow. So we're just creating like this very light value on our lupins. And then rinse your brush, and towards the top of the lupin, you're gonna see this like yellowy petals, okay? That's like the stalk before it opens. So add a little lemon yellow will work, cadmium yellow will work. And for our stalks, I'm gonna add a little water or stems to each pencil mark. And add a little bit of forest green, but really water it down so it's not super dark yet. And we're gonna come back to the lupin, and we're gonna come back to each of these to add darker values. Okay, now for our poppy, we're gonna add a wash on the petals, just the petals. Actually, I might add just a few stems here, or just a few lines to show that it's 3D. And now I'm gonna add my yellow to all the poppy. So California poppies are very orange, but they have a lot of yellow in them as well in the lightest parts. So we're gonna paint over the yellow with orange. And for the smallest stem, it's more of a light green. So I'm just gonna wash with a light green like we did for the lupins. And I'm gonna make a wash on the stems of light green. Okay, and we will come back to our poppies. You can wash this little lip with yellow also. All right, now for our iris, we're gonna make a pretty wild wash of magenta, just magenta, maybe a little bit of blue in it, but there's a certain part you shouldn't touch, which is this part that's really bright yellow. So just go around that part with your brush and the water. So I'm not gonna let that bleed in there. And I'm gonna use my magenta and some phthalo blue to get this really nice purple and just let it bleed through the flower. Get some more pigment, brush it on. And this little tip is also purple, or it's gonna be almost bluish purple, but for our wash, we can just do a purple. Okay, and that's all I'm gonna do on the iris at the moment. I'm gonna go back to my lupin, which is pretty dry. Depending on where you are, it might be drier or more humid. If it's more humid, it's gonna take longer to dry. So I'm mixing magenta with phthalo blue to get a nice deep purple for my lupin. So I have this deep purple. I'm just gonna touch the side, the left side of these petals with the bluish color, and then I'm gonna show you how to blend it in a bit. So using your water, you're gonna rinse your brush and then get all the pigment out of your brush. And you need to work kind of quickly because the paint's drying as you work. So I'm just gonna help it bleed a little bit into the petal so that it's blended. And if it bleeds a little into the next one, that's okay. All right, last I'm gonna add some darker value for my lupin petals. So I'm gonna use forest green mixed with ultramarine blue to get this really, really deep, dark green. And if it's a little too like emerald, you can add some burnt umber to it, a brown, to make it more realistic green. And then I'll add more green, kind of play around with mixing until you get the right color green you want. And we're just gonna add some darker petals on our lupin. Or on the leaves, not petals, but the leaves. And then we're not gonna paint all of it dark, but just some spots will be darker. So that gives like a really nice contrast to your watercolor. Okay, and I'm gonna rinse my brush, and then some of my lupin petals are a little too pink for me. So I'm gonna create a really light wash of purple and get some deeper purple on those. Okay, let's move on to our poppies. So I'm gonna use orange. I'm gonna just re-wet my poppies in case they got really dry so that my orange can bleed a lot. So this is a really, really bright orange I'm gonna use, and it's gonna bleed quite a bit into your poppy. I'm just gonna put it to the left of all these lines where the petals are, and then I'm gonna rinse my brush, blot my brush, and blend it in to the rest of the flower. So you don't want this like abrupt contrast, you want a gradual change in your value. So I'm going to add a little more orange and bleed it in. And we still have a bit of yellow in the background that we can see. So you have some nice contrast with the yellow and the orange. Okay, and then same thing for the green. I'm going to use, actually I'm just going to use straight forest green, and I'm going to add some contrast on the side of this bud and on the left side of all the flowers. So our light source is coming from the top right, so all of our shadows are going to be on the left side. And rinse your brush, blot your brush to blend, because if you have pigment in your brush when you blend it, it's just going to create one value of color, and you want to have some contrast. Okay, and back to our iris. Let's go ahead and add the yellow in the white parts, and this is gonna make it look more like an iris. Let's add our green stem. And so I'm using a wet on wet method. Wet on wet means that you put wet on your paper. So you use water, you wet the paper, and then you add some pigment, and it helps it bleed, it helps it blend more consistently when you use this wet on wet method. So just the basic light value to start with, and we'll get darker a little later. Okay, we'll come back to that iris. It's not quite done yet. Okay, we're gonna do our deciduous tree. So I'm gonna wet the trunk and some of the limbs. I'm gonna wet all around the tree where the leaves would be, are like basically around all the trunks and little branches, okay? All right, and then we're gonna use a light green, maybe with some yellow, make it really pale. And we're gonna blot or stipple the green all throughout our tree. You can leave some holes where the light's shining through, which will make it look a bit more realistic. So the method I'm using is called stippling, where you just use lots of dots and foliage. This works well with foliage, this method. And if your trunk's still wet, we're gonna add a little brown and blue. So brown and blue make black, but if you water it down, it makes a nice gray. And we can use that for this trunk. I probably won't go too much further because it's gonna bleed. All right. Let's clean the palette. If yours is dirty like mine, you can just use some water and swish around all your pigment. I need to start fresh at this point. And then use your paper towel to blot up all that watercolor pigment that's turned brown. And you can start fresh that way. Okay, so for these fir trees, we're gonna use 3 different values of green. So I'm gonna get really dark first. I'm gonna use green plus ultramarine blue and maybe a little bit of brown. So that's my darkest value for the tree, for the fir tree. Maybe a little more blue, because fir trees sometimes look blue. Okay, and then I'm gonna make a medium value just by adding some water to it. Maybe a little more blue. And then a really light value, like a gray, for the trees that are furthest back. And let's start with the trees that are the furthest back. So those are the lightest. When you use atmospheric perspective, those trees are gonna be really light. And I'm just gonna brush this directly on to my tree. Not a wash, no wet on wet, just use the direct pigment. And I'm using some light brush strokes. These are like tall trees. They grow in the mountains. They grow on the coast in California as well. The coastal redwoods are very iconic in California. Okay, and we'll just leave those 2 darkest ones first. Let's go ahead and add some dark green to our deciduous tree. It's pretty dry, but it can bleed a bit. So I'm gonna use my dark green, maybe a little more green in there, and start to add some dark stippling value on the left side of the tree, only the left side, because if you want to create a lot of contrast, one side can be darker than the other in your tree. And maybe I'll use some just green. And on this side, there's some dark value, but it's not all dark. So I'm adding some green on the right side. And just once in a while, rinse your brush, blot your brush, blend it in so it's not such an abrupt contrast from light to dark. Okay, let's go back to our fir trees. We're gonna use our middle value on this tree. So this tree is gonna appear a little closer because it's a little darker. So I'm just going on one side of the line, now the other side of the line with this medium value. Okay, let's do the same value on this line here. Okay, and then for the darkest value in the foreground, or the tree that's closest to us, let's get some dark pigment again, a little bit of water to it, and go for it, really dark. So it's gonna look like it's closer to us because it's darker. Okay, and maybe you can see one more tree in the background, way out down here. And one more way back here. Okay, now it looks like a forest. You could even add more trees if you wanted to. You could add more pencil lines. Let's do our cypress, and then we'll go back to our iris. So for the cypress, this one's pretty fun and it's pretty simple. So you're gonna add water across all the pencil lines that you originally made. Try to remember to keep some holes, meaning don't touch some of the paper so that you have little areas where the light's gonna shine through the cypress tree. Okay, and we'll do our other one with just water. If there's some pigment in your water, that's okay, because this is all gonna turn black. So this is like a silhouette of a tree, which often happens at sunset. You'll see like beautiful trees with a black silhouette, and it's always really fun to paint sunsets that way. It comes out looking really strong. So we're gonna use ultramarine blue and burnt umber brown to make a black, okay? So if you mix those two, they make black. You can also use just black. And we're gonna let it bleed into the tree. Try to touch only the parts that you put water on with your brush, and make sure to leave some holes where the light is shining through the tree. So we have these really horizontal type leaves on a cypress. Okay, so we'll come back to this cypress in a few more minutes. Let's go back to our iris, and we're gonna mix magenta and blue. I would recommend phthalo blue, which is brighter than ultramarine, so you get a nice, rich, bluish purple, okay? And let's put some water back on our iris because it's probably dry. A bit too dry by now. And this is really gonna make the contrast on your iris, okay? So I'm putting a little water on the tip of this one as well. Take your beautiful phthalo and magenta color and let it bleed onto the iris, okay? Don't touch the yellow. And you can go up into part of these two stalks. Okay, and then quickly rinse your brush, blot your brush, blend the dark into the light purple. And I'm going to take more magenta with phthalo and get some nice contrast on here. Maybe some little lines, like veins in the petals. Oh, and this one back here, just put a little bit on the bottom. Blot your brush, rinse and blot. Okay, and then let's blend this a bit more. And maybe add a few more little petals coming off to the right and the left. Irises have lots of beautiful petals. Okay, we'll come back and we'll do the stem of the iris. Last thing I want to do is just add a bit more value to our deciduous tree here in the middle. So let's add a few more stippling marks with our brush just to get a really nice contrast of our shadows and our lights. And I'm gonna rinse and blot my brush and just blend these in a bit. So it's not like dark to light immediately. It's a little more gradual than that most of the time. Okay, and then I'm just gonna add a few branches. So I'm gonna shade the trunk and use some choppy brush strokes to get some branches. You wouldn't see all the branches, like some of them will disappear behind leaves. You just see some of them. And I'm just gonna blot and blend this trunk a little. Okay, now we're gonna add a little more detail to our cypress trees. Just some more black and little wispy leaves coming off the tips of the branches. So I like this one here. I'm not going to touch that, just maybe a few more minor details on the leaves. All right, last thing on our beautiful California flora practice is let's add some darker green to our lupin. So put some dark green on the left side of, oh sorry, this is the iris bud, and some darker green on these leaves here, maybe another one, another couple. You can be a little free with it. Okay, and then I'm gonna rinse and blot my brush and blend the bud. Okay, so here we have 6 different California flora. We have the lupin, poppy, iris, cypress, deciduous tree, and fir tree. If you want to learn more of these methods, I am doing a summer camp in July. You can check it out on my website at jennahobbs.com.